This is Rabbi Menachem Penner. It's my pleasure to once again be part of the Vayichan series. Last time was for Shavuos, for a Yom Tov. This time, unfortunately, for the 9 days and Tisha B'Av, which we have to commemorate again this year. Just as we draw inspiration from the Chagim, we need to draw inspiration from the times that are called Moed. Tisha B'Av is called a Moed. It is a set time. It's a time, unfortunately, at one point for disaster, for many, many centuries, for many millennia, for disaster. Please God, a time of celebration soon. And we need to learn from it as well. For Abosai, I want to speak about Sinas Chinam, but I'm not going to take this in the direction that you think. The title of the shiur is The Temple Was Destroyed, or the Mikdash was destroyed because of Sinas Chinam. Really? It is a little bit difficult to understand how Sinas Chinam could have brought down the second Beis HaMikdash. It makes for a good topic for Rabbanim. Sinas Chinam is a lot easier to talk about than the three Averos, which the Gemara tells us brought down the first Mikdash, Avodah Zarah, and adultery, incest, and murder. Probably much more relevant to talk about Sinas Chinam. But the question is, how did Sinas Chinam really bring down the second Beis HaMikdash? Is that really a reason to bring down a Mikdash? What are we supposed to understand? It is rather remarkable that 2,000 years after the destruction of the temple, we are still here, Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach, but we're also remembering. HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps the Jewish people alive. We keep Yerushalayim and the Mikdash alive. And part of our keeping it alive is remembering what brought us to the point of destruction and trying to learn for today. What are we supposed to understand? How are we supposed to react to the fact that the Beis HaMikdash may have been destroyed by Sinas Chinam? I want to present three approaches in this shiur. First, that of the Maharal. The second, that of the Meshech Chochmah. And the third, a more modern approach, which I think gives us perhaps the most powerful message for today. The Maharal, in Sefer Netzach Yisrael of the Maharal is about destruction and rebirth. It's about Galus and Geula, and about the connection between those two things. The Maharal at the beginning of the Sefer points out that Gaal and Golah, to be exiled and to be redeemed, is only separated by a letter. The letter He appears in Galah. The letter Aleph is in Gaal. And he talks about the fine line between destruction and rebirth, and the need to learn from the destruction in order to get to the place of Geula. The Maharal questions how it could be that the second temple was destroyed because of Sinas Chinam and what that means. And he says a remarkable thing. He says that the sins that brought down the Beis HaMikdash, the sins, according to the Gemara in Yuma, that the three big Averos were what brought down the first temple. And according to the Gemara in Yuma, which speaks of the fact that it was Sinas Chinam that destroyed the second temple, that source is actually, the earliest source seems to be the Tosefta which mentions not the word Sinas Chinam, but actually says, almost like an anti-Semite speaking, the Tosefta in Menachos, which says that the Jewish people loved money, but they didn't love each other. They hated each other. That idea is brought down in the Maseches Yuma, in the famous passage, which says that in the second Beis HaMikdash, the Jewish people were actually rather good people. They were righteous. But because of Sinas Chinam, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. How could that be? What does that mean? How can you compare Sinas Chinam, as bad as it is, to the three Averos? The Maharal, as he always does, approaches this categorically. The Maharal says that the sins that brought down the Beis HaMikdash needed to be the antithesis of the Beis HaMikdash. It's not simply a question of schar va'onesh, that because a sin is so bad, therefore we needed a terrible punishment like the destruction of the temple. Instead, the sins that bring down the Beis HaMikdash have to speak against, or have to prevent, the Beis HaMikdash from working. They have to obviate the Beis HaMikdash. They have to make the Beis HaMikdash not able to function. The Maharal says that the essence of the first Beis HaMikdash was a home for the Shekhinah. We know there were miracles in the Beis HaMikdash. The luchos were there. Everything. There was such a holiness, such a Shechina in the first Beis HaMikdash. What chases away the Shechina? These three Averos. The Maharal points out that these three Averos are also called Tuma, Tameh, something which is unclean. The Shechina can't coexist with a certain level of Tuma. And therefore, it was these three Averos particularly, not simply because they were so bad, but because they chase away the Shechina. The Shechina cannot coexist with Tuma. Therefore, these three Averos caused the destruction of the first temple. The first temple was about the Shechina, and these three Averos drive away the Shechina. What was the second Beis HaMikdash about, says the Maharal? The Shechina wasn't there in a certain sense. The Aron, the Luchos, was not there. There were no miracles in the second temple. What was the second temple? Says the Maharal, the second temple was something that the first temple actually wasn't. And that was a place for the entire Jewish people to come together to worship. Early in the first temple period, there is a break. There is a break between Rechavam, the son of Shlomo, and Yeravam ben Nevat. Yeravam establishes a northern kingdom, and in order to prevent the people from returning to the southern kingdom, he closes off the roads specifically to the Beis HaMikdash. The second temple, without the Shechina, was still a place that the Jewish people could gather, could be Me'ached Ha'am. It could bring the Jewish people together in the worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was the skula. That was the meaning of the second temple. Once the Jewish people couldn't get along, once there was sinas chinam amongst the Jewish people, the second temple couldn't function anymore. The second temple was a place for a unified Jewish people to come and to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The second temple was supposed to unify the Jewish people, but nothing could unify the Jewish people. There was too much hatred. And therefore the second temple ceased to function and therefore ceased to exist. So explains the Maharal that the sin of sinas chinam wasn't the most severe of sins, but since it undermined the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash, it led to its destruction. A different approach, perhaps, can be suggested based on the Meshech Chochmah. The Meshech Chochmah in Parshas Beshalach points out that generally mitzvos bein adam lamakom carry a terrible punishment in the Torah. When it comes to mitzvos bein adam lachavero, there really aren't very many punishments. Even if you steal and you have to return, that's not quite a punishment. And yet, he writes, although mitzvos ben adam, averos ben adam lamakom are more severe, and certainly the three averos are more severe, the calamity that befalls a community is greater when it comes to a community that cannot get along, to a community that violates mitzvos ben adam lachavero. He quotes the Yerushalmi in Peah that points out that in the generation of David HaMelech, although the people were righteous, the soldiers couldn't get along. The people couldn't get along, and therefore he lost soldiers in battle. Whereas at the time of the wicked King Achav, despite all the Avodah Zarah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu protected the people because they were able to get along. Somehow, it's not about the severity of the sin, but the result of the sin. The result of the sin of discord within the community is HaKadosh Baruch Hu removes his protection from the community. It's for that reason, points out the Meshech Chochmah, that we have this idea that the Dor HaMabul was destroyed because of the little petty things that they did to each other. They were committing terrible averas. But as long as they were able to get along, or if they had been able to get along, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have protected them from destruction. Once they could not get along, once they had the sin of Hamas, that was the reason then, despite all of the lack of morality, it was the sin of Hamas that removed the protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sinas Chinam isn't per se more severe, but the consequences, the particular punishment for Sinas Chinam, for discord in the community, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes away his protection from us. Other averos may be worse, but they don't exactly have the same effect. Maybe this, in a similar vein, is why the Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash, was destroyed specifically because of Sinas Chinam. Because it's then that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not that Sinas Chinam is as bad as the three worst Averos in our tradition, but it can certainly bring destruction. I'd like to suggest a third approach. An approach, I think, whose message is even more powerful to us as a community that struggles to get along. Vayichan, this project, is an attempt to try to bring together the Jewish community under an ideal, to remember the importance of unity. But I think that unity is needed now because we are at a critical time in history. If you think about which story more than any story represents this idea of Sinas Chinam, the sin of Sinas Chinam in Vayichan, it's the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Famous story of a very wealthy person who had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. He sends out an invitation. The invitation to a big party accidentally goes to Bar Kamsa, his enemy. Bar Kamsa shows up at the feast, and the host, the unnamed host, cannot deal with this. He cannot have Bar Kamsa there at his feast. Bar Kamsa understands that they're enemies. He just wants to not make a whole scene, doesn't want to be embarrassed. He offers to pay for half of the Seudah. But the host kicks out Bar Kamsa in what seems to be a terrible sin of Sinas Chinam. Amar, says Bar Kamsa, Ho'ol v'havu yasvi rabbanon v'lo machu bei, since the rabbis were sitting there and they didn't do anything, shma mina kanicha lahu. It must be that they too agree. It's not just this terrible host, it's everybody who's there, it's the leadership, they are all terrible people. What can I do, says Bar Kamsa, to punish these people? Bar Kamsa goes to the Roman government and he tells the Roman government that the Jewish people have rebelled. And the emperor says, why would I think that the Jewish people have rebelled? Why now? He says, I'll show you a test. Send a korban, send an animal as a sacrifice. Let's see if the Jewish people will offer it. If they will not offer it, it's an act of rebellion. It must be that they're not willing to bring your sacrifice in their temple. The sacrifice is sent along with Bar Kamsa, and Bar Kamsa makes a minor mum, a minor blemish, one that the emperor wouldn't even appreciate as a blemish. But he makes a tiny blemish that matters in halacha and wouldn't allow the korban to be brought. Savar Rabbanon Likrove Mishum Shlom Malchus. The majority of the rabbis felt that given the alternative, given that the melech, that the emperor would think that the Jews are rebelling, the better thing to do is to simply offer the sacrifice. Is it allowed to be offered? Technically not. But saving a life has to override everything, no? Savar Rabbanon Likrove Mishum Shlom Malchus. Amalei Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas. Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas says, Yomru Bale Mumin Craven Lagabi HaMizbeach. It's not just this moment. It's not just that you're not allowed to give. This will open up the flood doors. People will forget the halacha that a blemished animal can't be brought as a korban. It's not just this one day. Maybe if it was this one day, I could handle it. But we can't create the impression that an animal with a blemish can be brought on the Mizbeach. Savar Lamikdale. So they said, what are we going to do? I mean, if we're not going to bring it, it's going to be rebellion. Well, how's the emperor going to know if we brought it or not? Let's kill Bar Kamsa. To save the Jewish people, because in fact, if the emperor would find out that we wouldn't bring his korban, he could bring his armies. Let's kill, let's sacrifice, let's get rid of Bar Kamsa to save the Jewish people. The lo lezel v'lema, that he shouldn't go and tell the emperor. Amalei Reb Zachariah says, Yomru matil mum b'kodshim yahareg. Another halachic mistake will come from this. They will say that if a person makes a blemish in an animal, then they deserve death. And that's not the punishment for putting a mum in an animal. If people see that we kill Bar Kamsa, they will mistake and they will think that it was not a punishment for trying to kill us. It was a punishment for putting a mum in the animal. It's not that we're killing Bar Kamsa to save our lives and save the people. And therefore they leave Bar Kamsa alive. Bar Kamsa returns to the emperor, and the impression that the Gemara gives us was that this was the straw that broke the camel's back and brought the Romans ultimately to the gates of the Beis HaMikdash. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, An vasanuso shel Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas, the modesty, and here it probably doesn't mean modesty, it's his unwillingness to act. He was so timid. Hechriva et beitenu, v'sarfa et hechalenu, v'higlisanu me'artzenu. This was ultimately not the fault of the owner of the establishment, the host who brought in the wrong person. It wasn't the fault necessarily of the rabbis who said nothing. It wasn't the fault of Bar Kamsa. It was because of Zachariah ben Avkulas. Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas, says the Gemara, that he was responsible for the destruction of Yerushalayim and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara tells us elsewhere there were many reasons for the destruction. It was more than just sinas chinam. There were many averos that were going on. But Rabbi Yochanan somehow says in the Gemara on Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph that it was because of Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas, because he was too timid, because he didn't act, because he didn't strike down, he wouldn't allow them to strike down Bar Kamsa. That's why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. It's a very, very perplexing Gemara. Was it really Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas' fault? Now the reality is the Gemara does this sometimes. The Gemara is there to teach us a lesson. Of course you shouldn't be involved in sinas chinam. That is obvious. Is it obvious to anyone seeing this Gemara that you shouldn't kick a person out of your house? You don't need this Gemara to tell you that. What is the lesson we can learn? Can we learn a lesson from Bar Kamsa? Bar Kamsa's a Russia. He went and he told the Romans to go, he brought destruction upon. So who can we learn a lesson from here? Where is the Chiddush in this story? The Chiddush, Rabbi Yochanan says, is that even Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas was responsible. Because he refused, for some reason, because he seemed to be mistaken somehow about how to paskin in this situation. So because he was mistaken somehow, that led to the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, in one of his Sfarim, points out how dangerous the responsibility of a posek, the responsibility of a posek to make the right decision and the destruction that could come if, in fact, he makes a mistake. Somehow, the timidness, the anova, perhaps the modesty, the misplaced modesty of Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas led him to give the wrong psak. He perhaps wasn't brave enough, whatever that means. But Rav Henkin takes it in a slightly different direction. Because it's no coincidence that this Gemara also starts with a statement by Rabbi Yochanan. Everyone who learns this Gemara starts the Gemara after this statement of Rabbi Yochanan. But right before the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, there is a statement from Rabbi Yochanan. And it is, of course, the same Rabbi Yochanan who at the end of the story says it was Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas' fault. What exactly was it that he did wrong? How exactly should we learn? What is the lesson? The Gemara starts off, the Gemara that has all of these stories. Atarnagola, about all of those who are familiar with the Gemara, there's a whole series of incidents that these tiny things led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, to the destruction of Yerushalayim, to the destruction of its nearby towns. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ma'u dichsiv, what does it mean when we say, Ashrei Adam mefached tamid? A person should always be afraid. Ashrei Adam, praiseworthy is the person who is concerned, who is worried. Umaksheli bo yipol bara'ah, and someone who hardens his heart will fall into danger. Elsewhere, the Gemara says that, very similar to what we said before, that the fear needs to be a fear of paskening incorrectly. Ashrei Adam mefached tamid. On the one hand, this can actually just be a proof for the earlier idea that we brought, that a person should be afraid, not in general in life, but they should be afraid of giving the wrong psak. B'divrei Torah ksiv. A person has to be very, very, very careful. Somehow Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas made a Torah mistake, a halachic mistake, and look at the result of what he did. But I think that the Gemara can be understood in a simpler way, and Rav Henkin also mentions this idea as well, that the pachad is not simply a pachad for making the wrong psak, but that the pachad is a pachad that comes from understanding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't always step in to save us. Rav Henkin writes that there are 3 different states that the Jewish people live in. There are times where the Jewish people are so righteous that it doesn't matter what the enemy tries to do to us, we will prevail. In the long term, Klal Yisrael is righteous, and that's the long-term projection for the Jewish people. We will absolutely prevail. But in a given generation, in a given war, at a given moment, there are individuals who are so righteous that they rise above teva, they rise above nature, and they'll be protected no matter what. There are times when the Jewish people are so deserving of punishment that no matter what they do to try to protect themselves, they can't outthink the Ribono Shel Olam. The Jewish people deserve to be punished, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu will allow their enemies to succeed. There are times of chesed, so to speak. There are times of din. There are times when the din is coming to Klal Yisrael no matter what. But much of Jewish history is not spent at a time of incredible divine chesed or incredible, unfathomable divine din. Most of Jewish history is spent in the middle zone of Hester Panim, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we don't understand his ways, will step in on some level, but will seem to allow natural things to also occur to us. We aren't so wicked that we are necessarily deserving of terrible punishment, but we are not so righteous as to be able to what? To avoid the consequences of our own mistakes. To avoid the consequences of those who want to destroy us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not necessarily using them at that moment as a shaliach for an onesh. But we might not be righteous enough to earn a miracle that at a given moment and at a given time, we will be saved. If that's the meaning of Ashrei Adam mefached tamid, then the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa and the entire story of the destruction takes on a different tone. Almost immediately after the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the Gemara brings another story. The Gemara talks about 3 very wealthy people who lived in Yerushalayim. Nakdimon ben Gurion, ben Kalba Savua, and ben Tzitzis Hakeses, and explains these very interesting names that they had, and talks about the great wealth and the great chesed that these 3 men did in Yerushalayim right before it was destroyed. The Gemara tells us that these 3, at the time of the siege of Yerushalayim, these 3 men offered to personally feed and provide the fuel for all of the Jewish people in Yerushalayim. And the Gemara attests to the fact that between the 3 of them, there were 21 years of supplies for them to withstand this siege. But infighting broke out. There was a group called the Marion. There was this very, very strong group. The rabbis were hoping to make peace with the Romans. perhaps to save off the destruction of the temple, and the Biryoni wouldn't let them leave the city to do that. The Biryoni wanted to leave the city, but to fight, to rebel against the Romans. And the rabbis told him it's just not going to work at this point. And they were at a stalemate. They were sitting there inside the siege, and they had food for 21 years. Says the Gemara, the Biryoni burned the stockpiles of food, and that brought about a famine. They couldn't wait. They needed to get out. They needed to fight the enemy. And they burned down the storehouses and brought about the starvation. They brought about the crisis. What do these two stories have to do with one another? An overconfidence at a difficult time. The Biryoni were so convinced that God was with us that they could burn down the stockpiles and bring a famine, and that's only going to help us because we're going to go out and we're going to fight. And the rabbis understood on some level that it was not a time of divine chesed. What was wrong with what Reb Zechariah ben Avkulas did? Why was his psak incorrect? His psak, on one hand, doesn't make any sense to us. I mean, I understand that we don't want to create an impression that an animal with a mum could be brought as a korban or not, but we don't want to create an impression that the person gets the death penalty for this. Why would he be so machmir on the smallest details of what was going on? Because it seemed that he was convinced that God was going to protect them no matter what. If there was nothing on the line, if there was no danger to the Jewish people, then why not? Why not be machmir in that way? What he didn't realize was that it wasn't a time to be timid. It was a time to be afraid. It was a time to realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not necessarily going to protect the Jewish people against their own mistakes. What does it mean that Sinas Chinam caused the destruction of the Second Temple? The people were basically good people, but they weren't tzaddikim to the point that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to save them no matter what they did to each other. The Sinas Chinam that brought down the second Beis HaMikdash may not have been a Sinas Chinam that was punished with destruction. But because they couldn't unite, they couldn't fight together. They couldn't function together. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed them to suffer the consequences of their own mistakes. Their own mistakes. What brought down the second Beis HaMikdash wasn't sin, it was error. The second Beis HaMikdash wasn't destroyed as a punishment. The second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because they caused it through their own infighting, through their own hatred of one another, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't feel that they were righteous enough that he was going to step in. Both say we live in very, very dangerous times. We live in great times of anti-Semitism. We live in times of a pandemic. Ashrei Adam mefached tamid. What does that pasuk mean? It doesn't mean that we don't have faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It just means that one has to see the writing on the wall. One has to understand that we're living in dangerous times and rise to that occasion. It's not that we shouldn't be involved in Sinas Chinam. We can't afford Sinas Chinam. How could we have Sinas Chinam? How could we do something that might take away the divine protection from us at such a dangerous moment in Jewish history? So many times in Jewish history, we haven't risen to the moment. We didn't realize that it was a moment that we needed to put aside our petty disputes, our petty habits. We are living in historic times, but dangerous times. Ashrei Adam mefached tamid. We dare not make mistakes. We dare not hate each other. We dare not rip the people apart as a disease, and the nations of the world are trying to do that themselves.